John Murray once said, more and more, I tend to read history. I often find it more up to date than the daily newspapers. Keep this in mind as we discuss today with one of our guests the importance of understanding history and how it can predict a country's behavior. My name is Dr. David Oualaalou.
And my name is Dr. Ross Stewart.
And you are watching Geopolitics in Conflict.
We'd like to thank you for watching. We'd like to thank you for subscribing. As you know, we're inching closer and closer to our 70 million subscribers.
Right.
We're getting there. And we also have
our membership. Yeah. So please check it out. Check us out at geopoliticsinconflict.com. So, and we all want to thank you for your support.
David, our guest today is here by request of many of our viewers. By name, they requested him.
Indeed, they did. I remember the comments where they're asking, can you bring this specific guest? I said, sure, we'll be happy to. So, well, we do have the guest with us here, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest. Dr. Hammond teaches history at New Mexico State University. His academic teaching focuses on global history since the 1500s, China through the Ming, and a history of a global political economy. Dr. Hammond is also the associate editor of Journal of Chinese History, published at Cambridge University Press. He received his PhD from Harvard University in History and East Asian Languages Studies. He specializes in the history of China in the early modern period, especially the 16th century. Dr. Hammond was the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook, and also he was the author of the monograph Pepper Mountain, The Life, Death, and Posthumous Career of Yang Jianzheng. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
Good, close enough.
Yeah, between 1516 and 1555. He has also published numerous articles on Chinese intellectual and political history. Professor Hammond, welcome.
We're delighted
to be here. Very glad to be here.
Great, great. Well, we don't want to waste so much of time because we want to pick your brain on so many topics regarding history. And I'm going to get into it right away. And my first question, Professor Hammond, is from a historical perspective, given your background, of course, why is the West unable to understand China?
Well, it's a great question. Why is there so much trouble in the West in understanding China? I think that the first way to approach that question in some ways is China is a fully developed civilization that has followed a historical path, a historical trajectory that has been distinct from that of the West. It's just as sophisticated. It's just as complex. It has its own ups and downs, just as Western history does. But from the earliest times, China's history has followed a trajectory, an itinerary that has been entirely distinct, which is not to say that there aren't elements in common. Obviously, if we look at politics, if we look at culture, art, literature, things like that, there are things in Chinese civilization, things in Chinese history, which have their parallels in the West. But the long trajectory has brought China to a modernity of its own, which is very distinct, very different from that of the West. And when Western analysts, academic or political, try to understand China, they often, I think, do so by working from their own culture, their own environment. And in many ways, that's perfectly understandable. But once you do that, once you put on those glasses, those lenses of your own culture, you're not going to be able to read China in its own terms, in its own right. And there's many examples we could talk about of this, but it's just It's just a set of circumstances where you kind of have to try, and it's difficult to set aside your assumptions, your predispositions. In a sense, there's an old from the 60s kind of humor about everything you thought you knew about whatever is wrong. And when we deal with China, that's often the place from which we have to start. We have to be willing to set aside our expectations. I don't really want to say our prejudices, but our intellectual predispositions, and engage with China on its own terms, in its own framework, in its own context. And for the Chinese, that is always a deep historical one.
Two things with this. Arnold Toynbee, the historian, one of the things he said is you've got to step out of your own culture, your own time, and look at what was going on then, and as much as possible, identify with the people there if you're going to gain any real understanding of what's going on. And I think that's one of the things you're saying.
Absolutely. The Belgian art historian Pierre Reichman, who wrote a lot under the name of Simon Leys, wrote a wonderful essay about exactly this question, about the differences between China and the West, and argued that it isn't just looking as if we were looking at something in a mirror where we see a reflection of ourselves. It's more like in Alice in Wonderland terms, going through into a completely separate realm where things make their own sense. They have their own framework, but we can't just look around and say, oh wow, now I get what's going on. It takes time. It takes a deep engagement, and unfortunately, in our modern media culture, what people want is a quick fix and a sound bite and a way to make sense of something that doesn't involve a lot of depth. And I think that when you deal with China, that's a formula for misunderstanding, if not disaster.
Something else in studying Mandarin, which I've been involved with for a while, Mandarin is a contextual language. You're always setting the content, and okay, you know what I'm talking about. And so one of the things that's real exciting to me about talking with you is you've got the historical context to place all this in. Does that make sense to you?
Sure. And I entirely agree with your point about the language. Chinese is a language, especially classical Chinese, is a language. When I was in graduate school and my cohort, we were all struggling with trying to master classical Chinese. We used to say that you have to know what it says to know what it says. Meaning that if you get a text, you get a document, a writing of some kind, and if you sort of know what it's about, then you can pick your way through it and make sense of it, and it takes time and all that. But if you just get it and you don't know what it's about, it can be a real challenge because the language is very, as you say, it's very self-referential. You have to know a lot of the cultural background. You have to be able to see allusions and references that aren't immediately apparent. And that's a very, very different kind of intellectual process. And the way that a language is structured, both as it's spoken and of course with Chinese, especially as it's written, shapes the way that we think about it. In some fairly important ways. I was talking with some friends recently. I just spent some time in Italy, and we were talking about European languages and how often there are multiple words for the same thing. Oh, yeah. Whereas in Chinese, one word can refer to multiple things.
Exactly.
So it's a very different kind of linguistic experience.
So, well, what I want to touch on is the idea of a couple of years ago, I wrote an article and suggested that it is most likely that the 21st century will belong to China. And I'll say straightforward, I was laughed at. Oh, no, they can't be. Okay. And what I wanted to ask you, Professor Hammond, is the idea of what can China history tells us about its foreign policy given the current dynamics on the geopolitical landscape?
Well, it can tell us a lot. and again, as ever in dealing with China, we have to look when we talk about China's history. We're not talking about the last 100 years. We're not talking about the last 500 years. We really have to look at very, very long spans of time. And when you do that with China, some very, very basic patterns, I suppose you would say, emerge pretty quickly. China does not have a history of sort of expansion outside of its kind of natural territory. There's a long history going back more than 2,500 years of the sort of the expansion of the realm of Chinese population. It starts in North China more than 3,000 years ago, and then there's a wave of migration to the south, the filling in of a lot of territory within what comes to be kind of the core agricultural zone of China. But once that process is completed, China doesn't then go out and look for new empires to conquer, new areas to expand. It doesn't develop, a maritime naval force to go out and take over other countries, even though it has massive and extensive and long-lasting trade relations with countries all over Asia and even Africa. It doesn't pursue political power and project military power beyond its kind of natural environment. The one period where that's different, which is what gives rise to the People's Republic as we have it today, is the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty that does add new territories. But that's a dynasty ruled not by the Chinese, but by the Manchus, a non-Chinese people who conquered the empire in the mid-17th century. So they brought in a lot of other non-Chinese groupings to sort of help, balance the political context within the empire. And that legacy remains with us today in the expanded territory of the Qing that is inherited by the Republic in 1912 and by the People's Republic in 1949. But even there, there are natural kind of parameters within which imperial states or modern states now centered on China have flourished, and they don't go beyond that. So the fears, the anxieties that are articulated sometimes by politicians and media about an expansionist China simply are not in line with the long history of Chinese political units centered and based in China.
Wow.
Well, you listen to Xi Jinping, and he mouths those words pretty directly. He doesn't want to expand. He doesn't want to own the world. He wants win-win scenarios everywhere they go. And it seems to be there's an historical base to that.
Sure. China, for millennia, China was the most sophisticated, the most prosperous, the most technologically advanced society and economy on the planet. And certainly from the Sung dynasty about 1,000 years ago on, it developed its own sort of commercial capitalist economy that reshaped urban life and even agricultural production and exchange. And it was a wealthy, powerful, sophisticated society. That changes in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution in the West, the ability of the European powers to project military force, the Opium War in the late 1830s, early 1840s, and that transforms China's relationship with the rest of the world. But after 100 years or so, they figure out a path to reunify their country, to strengthen their country. They've been on this course of reform and development now for a long time, and they are re-emerging as a powerful force within global society, within global affairs, especially in the economic sphere. That's not, we hear a lot about China's rise, and I think that's not the best way to conceptualize this. Right. It's not just China's rise, it's the return of China. It's China's resumption of a role within global affairs, which it played throughout history, throughout previous history. The period from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, that's the exception. That's the deviation, if you will, from the normal patterns of global affairs. And so China's return to the global stage, this just makes sense. It's just the sort of the reconfiguration, the return of global configurations to their long established patterns. It's hard for those who have benefited from this period of Western dominance, especially the United States. It's hard to accept that. The United States, has a sort of willful historical amnesia. And so we like to think that once we became the dominant power in the world, especially after World War II, we would just stay that way forever, But that was itself part of this anomalous period. Once the Western monopoly on modern industrial technology is broken, and once former colonized peoples are liberated, the global economy begins to return to its more traditional, multi-centric system. And frankly, I think that's only natural and normal and probably a pretty good thing.
When you consider the animosity that the United States and Western powers have toward China, what do you think's behind that?
Well, I think it's an anxiety about the ability of the United States to continue to have the kind of leading role in the world, which it has enjoyed for the last, 70 years or so, maybe a little more than that. Excuse me. I think that American political elites, especially, are anxious that their global dominance is going to fade. And I think that they're correct in that assumption. I mean, I don't think that that's a misapprehension. But I think that they're asking the wrong questions about that. I think that they approach it as a kind of zero-sum game.
Yeah.
China's gain has to be America's loss. And I think that drives this anxiety, this fear, this hostility and antagonism that has increasingly come to dominate American politics. And this is not a partisan issue. This isn't the Democrats or the Republicans. This is something about which it's one of the few things about which there's apparently a consensus amongst these political elites that China's rise is America's loss. And I think that's unfortunate because China's rise is just a historical inevitability. China's return to its position in the global system. The question for American elites, as for people all around the world, should be, how do we make the most of this? How do we see this as an advantage, as an opportunity, as a moment of hope and renewal and some sort of shared future that we can forge together, rather than being defensive and isolationist and, let's try to stop this in some way. You're not going to stop it. So figure out how to make the best out of it.
Something that's confused me about this is how much big money has invested, American big money and Western big money has invested in China. And then they said, well, let's hold China back. What is that about?
Well, I think that there are divisions within American elites, and it's interesting because I think a lot of what drives the antagonism with China today doesn't actually arise in sort of in the corporate sphere. A lot of American businesses have made a lot of money in China. Maybe they haven't had the entirely free market, wide open, Wild West kind of access that they might like, but even so, they've made tremendous profits in China, and China has benefited from those investments. It's been, in many ways, kind of a win-win relationship. But now, again, I think because of these security anxieties on the part of elites, there's this fear that is then being projected into the corporate relationships. Why not, for example, this whole thing with Huawei, the Chinese 5G technology? Why does that have to be an antagonistic relationship? Why can't there be a situation where we try to find ways to produce a 5G technology that would be a global standard that everybody would be able to get on board with, that isn't going to be exclusively Chinese or exclusively American, but something that would be beneficial for all parties concerned, But instead, what we have is an attitude that says we only, we're going to force people to use our 5G.
Yeah.
And these, they're managing to share their 5G with other people in the world. So you're going to wind up with a global system where technologies are incompatible with one another for really no rational, no economic reason, but one that's shaped by the political interests of the American government, and I think that's very unfortunate.
And that was the same point we were talking about last time about when we did the show on the Huawei, that it will make perfect sense if they can communicate.
Absolutely.
The US
There's so many win-win scenarios here.
Yeah.
And you listen to the Chinese leadership, and they say it out loud in words over and over and over again.
Sure.
Yeah. I like to shift to one specific geographical area. We cannot talk about China without talking about Taiwan.
Sure.
And what I would like to have our viewer understand is, we all heard the arguments, Taiwan wants to be independent. Well, historically, Taiwan is part of China. But a lot of people in the West, when this statement like this, they don't understand the historical context that goes way back under which or how this came to be. So I would like to have your input about where do you see this tensions that the West is pushing this narrative towards, Taiwan independent and all that, and how do you see China reacting or responding to that?
Yeah, well, I think that Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, has been part of Chinese political units, since at least the 13th century. Wow. That's a very, very long time. Wow. And it's formally part of Fujian province until late in the 19th century. It becomes a province in its own right. Then, of course, it's separated. It's ceded to Japan after Japan defeats China in 1895 in a war, and it's part of the Japanese Empire for 50 years. Comes back to China at the end of World War II, but then in 1948-49, the nationalists retreat there, and then you get this division across the straits. The government in Taiwan calls itself the Republic of China.
Right.
That means that it's China. I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. If you go to Taipei and you go to a bookstore and you buy a map of China, there's Taiwan and there's the rest of the country. It's one country. If you go to a bookstore in Beijing and you buy a map of China, there's China and Taiwan is one of the provinces. Both sides of the strait agree, the governments on both sides of the strait agree that there's only one China and Taiwan is part of China. They have a disagreement stemming from the historical conflict of the 20th century about who's the government. But practically speaking, they're both part of this political entity, right? Now, at the beginning of, was it October, or I can't remember if it was October or November, but Xi Jinping gave a very important talk about all this. And he was very clear that this is a problem, this is a question coming down from history that needs to be resolved by the Chinese people themselves. This isn't something that American politicians ought to be spouting off about, fanning the flames of conflict. This is something that the Chinese people should resolve amongst themselves. And there's no hurry, right? Yeah. No one is chomping at the bit to say, we're going to reunify, we're going to impose, one system or another. Taiwan is not trying to take over the mainland. The mainland is not trying to take over Taiwan. This is a situation where let's let the history go forward. There are billions of dollars invested from Taiwan into the mainland and from the mainland into Taiwan. There's tourism back and forth. Millions of people travel back and forth. Hundreds of thousands. I think the last figure I saw was almost 700,000 people from Taiwan working in jobs on the mainland. the connections between these two parts of China are strong and getting stronger all the time. A conflict, any kind of serious conflict, let alone outright military conflict across the straits, would be disastrous for everybody.
Yeah.
Well, the only people who might decide that they'd gotten something good out of it would be, these politicians, these posturing political figures in America, who think that the Taiwan issue is something they can use to whip up, a couple of extra points in the polls, in an impending election year or something like that. It's entirely irresponsible of American politicians to say the kinds of things and do the kinds of things that they've been doing recently, to try to drive this wedge in to a relationship that really should just be allowed to follow its own course. I also think, as an American, we fought a civil war over the question of secession.
Right.
We fought a civil war, the bloodiest war in American history, to prevent part of this country from separating itself and going its own way, because there was a constitution, there was a commitment, the development of our country that was a unified state. It was the United States of America, and we fought the Civil War to prevent secession. How the United States can then turn around and say, we want to promote the secession of Taiwan, which is not supported by the majority of the people in Taiwan. There are some people who want that, but this is not the majority opinion. How can we go in and say, we want you to separate, we want you to secede, when our own history tells us that that's an unacceptable course of action?
We talk about gross hypocrisy.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
And that's the exact point you've been always made, Ross, about the 47% in Taiwan.
Oh, yeah.
They want
40%. We read a study that said 47% of the people in Taiwan want immediate rejoining of the mainland.
Sure.
And going, hold it, 47% want to rejoin today?
Yeah. Well, you think about the population on Taiwan. The population on Taiwan is a complex demographic mix. You have indigenous peoples, non-Chinese peoples who had lived on the island for, millennia. I mean, they're more closely related to Austronesian populations, Polynesian populations. That's a small group, mostly in the mountainous country on the east side of the island. You have Chinese who had begun migrating there certainly as early as the 13th century, and that population grew. That was a stable society until 1948, and then you have this wave of evacuation from the mainland when the nationalists lose the Civil War and the revolution comes to power. So you have a mix of people. A lot of those people who came over in 1948, 1949, the rank and file military personnel, many of them were separated from their families. Their wives, their children, their parents were back in their native villages on the mainland, and for 40 years, they had no contact. There was no interaction. When it became possible, because of good steps towards reconciliation back in the 80s, there was a flood of family reunions, of people going to the mainland, people from the mainland coming to Taiwan. This is a single society. This is a single culture. The greatest treasures of Chinese historical culture are in the Palace Museum in Taipei. If Taiwan wants to be independent, let them give that stuff back. Right? They're not going to do that, because that's Chinese culture, and that's what's there. So let's let the problem solve itself. Let's let things muddle along. This is a great thing that Ross, I'm sure from your experience with China. One of the best ways to deal with problems in China is just to muddle along. Let's not push it. The Chinese talk a lot about what they call maodun, which is contradiction. And the idea is, let's not push it. Let's let the contradictory nature of things just kind of work themselves out. Over a process of historical time. Chinese people have Chinese culture, Chinese civilization has a very long historical perspective. The idea that we got to fix this right now. We're going to resolve this situation in the next 6 months or whatever. That's just not the Chinese way of doing things.
Yeah,
Not that one can generalize in an absolutely blanket.
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It's a long historical consciousness, and we need to let processes like this play themselves out through that kind of time.
And we see the 5-year plan, the 10-year plan, the 25-year plan. What's going to be here in 2060?
Yeah.
I mean, and they work toward it. I got so many things I want to talk to you about. Let me jump into what we see is President Trump was paying attention to something, and it eludes me as to what he was paying attention to declare China such an adversary. He come up with, let's do away with Confucius institutes. Let's do away with Chinese workers in research or faculty. Let's do, and it just, do you have any idea what he was paying attention to?
Well, of course, it's not just Trump. I mean, the Obama administration is when what they call the pivot to Asia is announced. November of 2011. He gives a speech about this. Secretary of State Clinton publishes an article in Foreign Affairs, sort of announcing that the United States is going to shift its intelligence and military assets to a greater focus on China, to a greater focus on Asia, which basically means kind of a neo-containment policy, this time directed at China. So it gets rolling there. Trump certainly accelerated that, although in his own peculiarly schizophrenic way, wanting to be buddies with Xi Jinping, but having this hostile policy of the trade war and all that. I think he just liked the idea that he could call it a war, But I think that there has been a fundamental shift in American political attitudes towards China over the last decade, and I think that what we need to understand is kind of how and why that came about, because Obama, Trump, Biden now certainly carrying on these things, Secretary of State Blinken and his whole I'm going to give you a lecture about the rules-based order. That kind of attitude that's become characteristic of the American posture towards China, and that is a shift. But I think that it's one that's understandable in a sense, because I think for a long time, in the 90s, in the first decade of this century, there was an expectation, a hope that the process of economic reform and the increasing prosperity of the Chinese economy and the Chinese people would lead in some sort of teleological way to a political transformation, that some sort of color revolution would take place in China, and it would then open itself up to a much greater penetration by Western interests, by American capital, for example. And for a long time, the Chinese political leadership took a kind of low-key approach of their own. Deng Xiaoping very wisely, I think, back in the 90s, urged the other leaders, as he put it, to bide their time on the international stage, to not emphasize the differences between China and the West, but to engage with the global system, engage with Western business in order to develop China's economy. The long-term goal of building a socialist system, a more egalitarian, a more fair and just system, that has remained, that's what animates Chinese political life. But for 20 years and more, they didn't make a big deal about that, and I think that allowed Western political analysts to sort of, in a sense, fantasize that China was going to go through some sort of fundamental transformation. By the time of the Obama administration, as China began to see the fruits of its policies, the fruits of reform, as prosperity spread, as they were able to advance their struggles against poverty, as they were able to become more self-reliant, they became more self-confident, and especially under Xi Jinping, more self-assertive. And so I think now some political leaders in the West kind of feel like, not that they were swindled, but that, oh, these expectations aren't really going to come true. They're not going to become totally capitalist. They're not going to become a wide open free market where we can just go in and do whatever we want. They really are. I think for Western politicians, for certainly for Trump and very much for Biden, the scariest thing about Xi Jinping is that he's actually a communist. Right?
Yeah.
He's the leader of the Communist Party, and son of a gun, he's actually a communist, And I think that has triggered this reorientation of American policy. That they see that China is in fact following a different path, following a course that isn't going to just subordinate it to American global interests, but they want to be their own country. They want to follow their own course of development. They want to pursue their own interests in the world.
Oh, what a concept.
Yeah, I know. What they want to do is subordinate themselves to America's interests, be good little brothers, and sisters, and play along. And they can have some crumbs, but that's not what they want, and that's not what they're doing. And they've never said they were going to do that. But I think that the consciousness of that, the realization of that, has driven this new antagonism, this new kind of Cold War mentality that sees China not as a partner, not as a potential collaborator, which I think would be a much better approach, but instead sees them as the other and as a hostile other, as and all this projection of, oh, they're expansionist, they're aggressive, they're totalitarian and authoritarian. All that stuff is just projection onto China by American political thinkers.
All the information said that, but I didn't quite see it until you said it. It's projection. Yeah.
It's that the geopolitical shift, I think, it's not, I think, it is, as an analyst myself, the West, and the United States for that matter, this geopolitical shift, they're not willing to accept it. They are not willing to accept the new sitting arrangement at the geopolitical table, shall we say, because, the seats have been rearranged, but not to the favor of the United States. That is, to me, what I see. That's why you see hostility coming from NATO towards now making China as the next target. That's why you see the hostility from U.S. policymakers in Washington. Most of the reports coming out of the Pentagon, and I had the chance to read some, it's just the language that is used. It's more inflammatory, more directed towards, an enemy, perceived or real, to justify whatever policies the West is going to be embarking on.
I think that this is we're in a period where it's very important to remember what John Mitchell used to say when he was Nixon's Attorney General, which is watch what we do, not what we say.
Yeah.
Because when President Biden and General Secretary Xi had their recent video summit, if we can call it that.
Call it that.
Yeah.
Imaginary summit.
Yeah. But it was it was a lengthy meeting, much longer than had been anticipated. And I thought that was very interesting. Yeah. Biden was very careful to emphasize that the United States continues to obey its own laws because the Taiwan Relations Act, which stipulates that we do not recognize Taiwan diplomatically, that's the law in this country. The agreements that we entered into with China in the course of normalizing diplomatic relations, those are still in force. We're coming up next February. It'll be the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique during Nixon's trip to China in '72, in which, that's the first time where the United States acknowledges that people on both sides of the straits agree that there's one China and Taiwan is part of China. So this is the established official position of the United States. And Biden was very careful to say that, yes, we continue to respect the one China policy and all that. But that's words that are said in a public context for the headlines and to try to calm the waters a little bit. But meanwhile, the United States secretly sends military troops to Taiwan.
Yeah.
We continue to do these completely provocative moves of sailing American warships through the Taiwan Straits, which are clearly the national waters of China, because the mainland and Taiwan are all China. So to sail through the Taiwan Strait is to go right through their territorial waters, and you know, it's just nothing but a provocative gesture, and so we have to watch what they do, even when they say things that sound maybe a little more calming and a little more rational. What they're doing is still provocative and very reckless and dangerous.
Oh yeah. One of the things I've been considering is that technologically, production-wise, and a whole lot of other areas, the United States cannot possibly keep up with China. We take a look at the number of patents. We take a look at the bursting economy that's still going strong. And one of the fears is that the United States is going to fall far behind, and China is really going to be an economic powerhouse. It's already ruling Southeast Asia. What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, again, you know, I always like to crank the history back.
Yeah. Good.
If there's a wonderful graph that is out there on the internet, anybody can find it, by a great economic historian named Angus Madison, who used to teach at the United Nations University. And he studied all kinds of massive data sets of global economic history. And he produced this one graph that tracks the proportion of global economic activity in different parts of the world over a long period of time. And I just yesterday used this in one of my classes here. What it shows is that if you go back, let's say, to around 1500, okay, China and India between them constituted a little bit over 50% of global productivity.
Wow.
Okay? Europe,
Yeah, really?
Europe was maybe around 22%. And the Western Hemisphere, of course, at that point was relatively minimal. And that pattern continues all the way down till the late 18th century. There's some ups and downs, but basically, if you went to, say, 1750, the pattern would essentially be the same. But then, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, things begin to change very dramatically. The Indian economy, first of all, starts to go down. And that's because Britain, which takes over India in the late 18th century, systematically deindustrialized the country. They had the greatest cotton textile industry in the world in India. The Bengali looms, you know, cranked out products that were in demand all over the world, the highest quality, the greatest volume, the lowest prices. It was a wonderful thing. They took it apart and sometimes literally took the looms apart and shipped them back to England, where they could be hooked up to steam engines, and you have the Industrial Revolution, right? So India starts to decline. There's a lag while the Industrial Revolution kicks in and the European, you know, line starts to skyrocket.
Yeah.
Then the British start selling opium in China. That leads to the Opium War. That leads to China being thrown open to European products, the destruction of native industries in China, and China's line goes way down until by the early 20th century, China and India together aren't even 10% of global productivity. Europe and America
That's shocking,
are
actually.
60%, right? What drives that is industrialization. And so long as the Western countries, Western Europe, North America, Japan later, so long as they maintain a monopoly on modern industrial productive technologies, they could control the world. That's how they built their colonial empires. That's how they dominated global military affairs. But in the 20th century, first in the Soviet Union on a certain relatively small level, they began to industrialize separately, independently of the West. And then after the middle of the 20th century, when India becomes independent, when China has its revolution, when other colonial societies break free of European domination and can now pursue their own economic development, modern industrial technologies begin to be dispersed, begin to diffuse around the planet. And once that happens, the dominance of the West is doomed, right? It can't.
Inevitably, you're right.
And so, exactly, Ross, what you were saying, China has been for the last 40, 50 years deeply engaged with the global economy so that it can acquire technology, it can acquire knowledge, it can develop its own domestic economy, it can be part of global trade. They invest so heavily in research and development. They produce more engineering PhDs every year than the United States does in a decade. Even just looking at something like clean energy, China now produces and consumes more alternative energy than the rest of the world combined. Right? They're pursuing these objectives very clearly, very deliberately, and very successfully. Right? So if the average Chinese worker, just the average Chinese worker, becomes averagely productive using modern industrial technologies at the same level as the average American worker, there's more than 4 times as many people in China as there are in America. So when Chinese productivity averages out to the same as American activity, the Chinese economy will be 4 times the size of the American economy.
Oh, I had no idea.
Wow.
That's not an economic miracle. That's just being average, right? That's going to happen. And trying to stop that, trying to hold that back is worse than King Alfred and the Tides. I mean, it's just, it's not going to happen. Or I guess it's King Canute, really. Anyway.
It's not funny, but it strikes me as hilarious. 4 times the American.
Yes.
Wow.
That's very, very interesting.
Oh, yeah. Let me change the
Sure.
subject slightly.
Sure.
We're looking at, I think last year, the income of the average Chinese worker rose 10%. This raises a bigger question for me. And that is, we hear all of these great numbers coming out of China, such as the last few years, 50 million people have been pulled out of severe poverty. Before that, from 2013 on, it was like, from 1991 on, 850 million people. Are those numbers believable to you?
Oh, I think so. I mean, there's a widespread skepticism about government statistics all over the world.
Yeah.
I think that often originating from people who don't like the statistics that they're encountering.
Right.
But the economic statistics produced by the National Bureau of Statistics in China, there may be systemic distortions to a sort of minimal and kind of unavoidable level based on whatever methodologies are used. You could use a different methodology and get some slightly different result, but I think basically their statistical information is pretty reliable, in part because there's still a significant element of economic planning in China. Screwing up your stats screws up your planning. So why fudge your stats? I think that they want reliable information. A modern, complex economy can't function without reliable information. This is the whole lesson of one of the great lessons of modern history, that information is power, and information has to flow to the people who need it. So in China is a super dynamic society and economy. All these mythologies that get propagated in the West about how it's oppressive and authoritarian, and I don't know. Sometimes I travel to China with tour groups. I go along and give some talks about Chinese history, and that's a lot of fun. And those first few days when you get 30 reasonably well-educated American people who've traveled in other parts of the world. You get them on the streets in Beijing, and the second or third day, they're coming up to me and saying, "What the hell is going on here?"
That's what happened to me when I was in Beijing.
Yeah, these people look
Guys
happy.
were like this, is going, what's going on? And then Xi'an and then Shanghai.
Yeah, they're well dressed, they're well fed, they're colorful, they're lively, they're smiling, they're happy, and where's all the repression? They
Right.
have this mythology about it, and it's just so wrong. So it's a place where there's so much dynamism, and they need reliable information. So yeah. I basically trust their statistics, especially when you deal with them as a series, because then if there's some bias one way or another, the series, the measurement of change is going to be reliable, even within whatever biases they have. So I think I'm pretty comfortable working with those kinds of figures.
That's interesting. So
I got one more. I just got to
sure,
ask.
sure. Yeah, I will still have some questions for Dr. Hammond. Well, I'm gonna let you go yet, Professor.
Hey, we're having a good time.
There's all these things I'm just so curious about. You take a look at Xi Jinping and his history, and you take a look at his father was an avid communist, really, although he fell out of favor with Mao. Xi Jinping managed to join the Communist Party, and this major influence that are going, how could a communist pull this off? When you look at what's actually been accomplished. First of all, how did he ever get into the Communist Party with it? And then, how did he rise to power? And then how did he maintain this with this severe competition that goes on at that level in government?
Yeah. Well, that's the internal dynamics of the party are not always easily comprehensible for those of us outside the ranks. In America, we prize the public display of conflict and competition, and that leads to a lot of kind of often rather phony posturing and driving people to positions that they don't necessarily actually mean or hold, or things like that, in order to have this public persona or presentation. Chinese politics is entirely opposite. Again, as we started out with, right at the very beginning, their political culture isn't like ours, and we can't expect them to behave in the same ways that we do, right? They, harmony, everybody getting along. This is what's important in stability in public life. So there are deep debates. There are strong conflicts within the Chinese Communist Party over policy, over how best to pursue development, over how to address particular issues and concerns. And we can, if you look carefully and read a lot of what gets written, which almost no one in the West does, but if you can, and you do, you can discern that there are certainly 5 or 6 distinct sort of, I don't want to call them factions, but interest positions within the party, and they're battling it out, and trying to figure out how to get their agenda accepted. And you're quite right. It can be a quite contentious process within the party. Xi Jinping, navigated very carefully, I think, and of course got some good breaks. His job before he became general secretary, he was the leading figure in Zhejiang province in eastern China, which is one of the great high-tech centers in China, and he managed that. He was party secretary there for a number of years before becoming general secretary, and that was probably the thing that allowed him to emerge as the most acceptable, the most desirable candidate to become the general secretary back in 2012 at the party congress then. So, we can't follow. You can follow a career in terms of the events that get announced in China, but we don't know a lot about the personal connections, the politicking, the horse trading. All that's got to be going on, but it's not done in public view. And of course, in the West, we think that's terrible, but that's very consistent with Chinese political culture historically. Factionalism was not allowed in the imperial system. 1,000 years ago, a great Chinese thinker named Ouyang Shou wrote an essay in which he laid out what he called the difference between private factions and public-spirited gentlemen, right? Public-spirited friendship. And basically what he said is that it's bad for officials or participants in the political process to get together to advance their private interests. But it's good for like-minded gentlemen with the interests of the empire at heart to share their perspectives. Well, how exactly that plays out, that kind of thinking still animates Chinese political culture today. So we're not going to see, the kinds of throwdown debates in the National People's Congress or the Communist Party Congress meetings. We're not going to see that. What we see is the presentation of the results of a lot of that going on behind the scenes. And that means that we can't really trace out the intricacies of that in ways that we might really like to. I'm sure it would be a lot of fun and interest.
Yeah. But one of the observations is that Xi Jinping has the best public relations team I could ever imagine. The stuff that comes up with him, he's a farmer, he's a real people person. He goes and that has to appeal to the Chinese people enormously.
I think he's very popular. I think again, one of the great myths in the West is that the party just tries to hold on to power by any means and all this. In fact, the party and Xi Jinping are incredibly popular. Even Western polling groups like the Pew Foundation and the Ash Group at Harvard, they do these polls and they're very, very careful about how they do them because they're trying, again, they want accurate information. They want reliable stats. And they show, support for the policies, support for the leadership in the mid to upper 80%.
Astonishing.
Biden would give his pancreas for that,
That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. So.
One last thing, and I promise I'll quit. We're seeing Xi Jinping going for yet another term. And of course, they had to change the Constitution to do this. And do you see a downside to that?
Well, only two leaders followed that 10-year policy, right? Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. And those were the leaders in the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century. Prior to that, there was no such limitation. They didn't do that term limits thing. I think that as China has entered into a more contentious period in terms of its relationship with the West, and as the leadership has determined to become more assertive domestically. I mean, reining in high-tech moguls like Jack Ma.
Yeah.
The moves that have been done to sort of stall or block the emergence of an educational elite. Putting these limitations on private tutoring and private education initiatives to ensure greater equality, greater access for educational opportunity. The party and the government are asserting more oversight, more regulation, more management over the private sector. That's a fraught process. It's been implied all along. The idea was we're going to use markets, we're going to develop the economy so that we can achieve a level of economic prosperity, a level of material abundance, which would allow us to begin to develop a more socialist, a more egalitarian, a fairer system of wealth distribution. They're taking the initial steps to that now. And that's a fraught process. There's going to be pushback from the private sector, all these
Mhm.
billionaires in China, just like billionaires everywhere. They want to keep those billions. They want more billions, right? So there's going to be some conflict and some struggle. And again, we're probably not going to see that thrashed out on the front pages, but it's going on. And I think that having Xi Jinping be able to continue for a third term is probably thought of in terms of stability, in terms of continuity.
Okay.
That these are big projects that are underway, and it's important to see them through. Now, do I think that they shouldn't have turnover in the leadership? No, I think that turnover in the leadership is good. And I think that even within Marxist tradition, you think about the historiography of the Paris Commune, for example. The idea is that there should be leadership, but it should be flexible. It should switch around. We don't want to see Xi Jinping simply become ruler for life or something.
Forever. Yeah.
That's not the agenda. That's not what they're doing. I think that we won't know until the party Congress next year if, in fact, he's going to stay on for a third term. I think it's very likely that he will. And I think in terms of staying the course, Xi Jinping likes to talk a lot about what he calls fulfilling the original mission of the revolution, improving the lives of the people, developing a socialist economy, developing a modern China that can stand up on its own 2 feet in a often hostile world.
Yeah.
That they're at a really critical point of inflection in that process, and the need for stability and continuity is going to be the determining factor.
That's very interesting. Well, before we let you go, Professor Hammond, I need to ask you one other question. As a matter of fact, there are two, but the key one. Well, there's the key one. I wrote a book about a year and a half ago about Russia. Okay, and in it, I addressed the idea of the relationship between China and Russia and how we work when it comes down to geopolitical landscape. Of course, we cannot ignore the historical animosity that existed between Soviet Union and China back then. And yet, I wedged my bet. I bet my hedge on it that I said both Moscow and Beijing will put those historical differences aside and work towards a partnership. Do you foresee that this partnership will survive moving forward, given the geopolitical dynamics?
Yeah, I think you're on safe grounds there. I think that that the common interests between China and Russia now are many, and that the leadership in both countries is interested in cooperation and collaboration. It's certainly very much in Russia's interest to have a positive relationship with China. And there are many things that are very beneficial to China in having a good relationship with Russia. The ideological antagonisms that led to the Sino-Soviet split, those are long in the past. I think that those issues need not be of concern anymore. The border issues have been resolved and settled. We're not going to see tensions around that kind of stuff. The interests in having a stable Central Asia, I think, are shared strongly by both China and Russia. And I think that that's an area where their collaboration and cooperation is going to be critical. So I think that the mutual interest, the convergence of interests between these two countries is just on a very practical level, it makes sense. They have this huge long border. They have this historical relationship. Imperial China and the Tsarist Empire had a long economic connection as well. So I think that China and Russia in a kind of partnership makes a lot of sense. That doesn't mean that their economic and political systems are going to be identical, and they're far from it. Russia has its own path, its own system that is very strongly influenced from the West, whereas China really, its political culture is still very, very rooted in thousands of years of its own, internal development. So I don't think they're going to, converge or merge or anything like that over time. But I do think that it makes sense for them to be friends and allies and partners in a lot of areas.
And that's what I argued, in the sense that they're gonna have the partnership, but not to the point of having like signed treaties, shall we say. So I don't see that happening personally. And the last one, Professor Hammond, and we promise is the last one.
We're doing fine.
What I wanted to address, and I'm sure, Ross, you thought about it too, about the BRI.
Oh, the Belt and Road Initiative.
The Belt and Road Initiative. You think about the old Silk Road. Once again, is the historical context. Where can we put the current BRI within the historical context?
Great question.
Well, I think the main thing about the BRI is again a recognition on China's part that they don't want to be, and they really cannot afford to be, just a subordinate component of an American-dominated global system. And so the BRI is an initiative which I think is aimed at developing global trade infrastructure, investing in the development of economies all over the world in ways which will be separate from, independent of, the oversight of American-dominated institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, things like that. The old Silk Road, of course, was the great connector that brought sophisticated products out of China, both overland. I mean, you have the overland routes, which really is what the Silk Road mostly meant, but what sometimes gets called the maritime Silk Road, the trade routes through Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, and even up through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea to Europe. Both of those traditional networks are returning, and again, that's just part of this long historical dynamic that with the Industrial Revolution, global trade became Eurocentric, and the networks of connection around the planet focused on the Western industrialized economies. Now, with once again a more multi-centric world within which Asia is going to be the leading, region. Now, new networks centered on China are being established, and again, it's a re-emergence. It's a return. It's not China looking around and saying, "How can we reach out and dominate the globe?" It's a return to rational patterns of interaction that existed and persisted for millennia before this. And now, once again, we're seeing the world be reconfigured in ways that are consistent with the role that China is going to play in the global economy. Again, as we talked about earlier, all they got to do is become averagely productive, and they're going to be a huge component of the global economy. Of course, there's going to be networks like this focusing on China. And China's not doing this as some sort of philanthropic giveaway, obviously. They're doing this to develop trade that's going to benefit China, but it's also going to benefit the countries that are receiving these loans and this investment and this infrastructure development. So I think that the BRI is a very important component of the overall process of the reemergence of China and the reconfiguration of global systems.
So it's interesting.
Let me congratulate both of you.
Sure.
In your book, you said China 2021.
Mm-hmm.
That was that 4 years ago?
That's correct.
Do you know when Dr. Hammond said that was going to happen?
When?
2004.
Wow.
And you said it was 2021 specifically.
Interesting.
Very impressive with both of you.
Well, I'm glad we agree. That's the main.
Well, I think the reality will agree with you right now, too.
Exactly. Anything to add, Ross, before we let Professor Hammond?
We can't thank you enough. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I think useful to our viewers. Again, we took their advice, invited you, and are we glad that we did?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well,
I'm very glad to have been here. A very enjoyable conversation.
Well, we'll give you the last word, Professor Hammond. for whatever you want to say to our viewers. We do have a large viewership, and they will be interested in whatever you want to close in with.
Well, I think, you know, when we think about China's reemergence in the world, and we think about the you know, it's a process of change, and change always generates friction and tension. What I hope people will focus on and think about is how to make the process of change beneficial for the most people. How
Yes.
can it be good for America? How can it be good for China? How can it be good for people around the world? Not to think of it as a zero-sum game, but to think of it as, you know, let's add value for everybody. You know, so you know, the things that unite us, the things that could unite us, are more important than the things that people try to make divide us.
Exactly. So for our viewers, Professor Hammond, if they wanna, where can they find you?
Well, they can find me. They can find me. My email. I'm always happy to respond to emails. My email is very simple. It's just Hammond, KHAMMOND,
Okay. Yeah.
at NMSU, New Mexico State University, nmsu.edu. So people can email me there. I'm happy to respond to that. I'm on Facebook.
Okay.
Okay.
You know, so
Yeah, and I have those. I will put them down on the description for the email. It's just we wanted to have your permission first.
Of
before I
course.
put that in. That's how
course.
always we do things. So
Yeah.
we can't thank you enough, Professor Hammond. That truly, and I hope for our viewers find this very, very insightful and informative. You can't find this anywhere else, and this is why we reach out to, you know, great guests to have, because we want to have a different perspectives for our viewers to also learn.
Our motivation is, and our intention is, give people quality information. Don't make up their minds for them. Don't tell them what they ought to believe. Here's the information. Do what's in your best interest, the best interest of your family, your business, but most likely your best interest. Think through it yourself.
Right.
And I think that quality information is what you gave us today. Thank you.
I certainly hope so. It's been a pleasure.
So for our viewers, we look forward to seeing you on Friday for live stream, because we're gonna do that. And remember to subscribe if you have not done so. And we look forward to seeing you next time. And as always, stay informed. Till next time. Bye-bye.